we see in Genesis, it says, "Now Joseph was well built and handsome. And after a while, his master's wife took notice of him and said, 'Come to bed with me.' And she spoke to Joseph day after day, but he refused to go to bed with her or even be with her. One day he went out of the house to attend his duties, and she said, 'Come to bed with me.' And she grabbed him. But he left his cloak in her hands and ran out of the house. She kept his cloak beside her until his master came home. Then she told him the story. 'That Hebrew slave whom you brought to us came to me to make sport of me. But as soon as I screamed, he left his cloak beside me and ran outside the house.' When his master heard the story, his wife told him, 'This is how your servant treated me.' He burned with anger. Joseph's master took him and put him in prison, the place where the king's prisoners were confined. And there he remained." Just when things were starting to look somewhat positive, he has connections with a very high official in Egypt, and things are going well. He's number one on that guy's list, and then all of a sudden he gets accused for raping his wife. That's not quite what you would imagine would happen. And you think that God would honor righteousness. You think that God would honor Joseph because Joseph chose to do the right thing. Joseph chose not to sleep with the man's wife behind his back, but as a result, he got thrown in prison for it. It's almost like a catch-22. It's like, well, I didn't see that one coming. That's kind of hard. And another interesting point about this is, in the ancient Near East, they didn't have prisons. They really didn't have prisons. Now the Egyptian Empire, they had prisons. They were the most powerful nation in the whole world. They were kind of ahead of their time. So they had prisons, but it was very, very uncommon to have a prison in the ancient Near East. Usually if you committed a crime, they would kill you. They would take some of your money. You would have to pay for it. Or they would mutilate your body somehow. So if you kill someone, or if you were to sexually assault someone, like sleep with another man's wife, they would kill you. If you stole something, then you would have to pay back what you stole, plus a little more for extra compensation for the trouble you caused them. And let's say you get into a fight and you punch someone in the eye and their eye falls out. Well, guess what? They're going to cut out your eye now. I mean, that's just the way it was. And when we read the Old Testament, it makes sense. When we see the law that God gave Moses, we see that God didn't set up a prison system for them either. It's almost like, hey, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. If you kill someone, okay, that's it, gone, bye-bye. So it was pretty effective, I think, in that day. And especially if you were to rape someone, like Joseph being accused of raping someone, I mean, you get killed. I mean, there's no ifs, ands, or buts about it. Like in that day, in the ancient Near East, you don't rape women. Like that's a big no-no. And we even see an interesting story about this, how Joseph, he had 11 brothers. He's one of 12, but he also had sisters too. And one of his sisters was hanging out with some of her girlfriends, and they went into town, but then she got kidnapped and raped. She came home, told her father about it. Well, there's nothing really they can do. They're just wanderers. They're kind of just, they wander the land here and there. They're not even part of a nation. They're not part of the society. They're not part of this pagan culture. They're separate. So, I mean, it's not like the officials there are going to do anything about it. What's Jacob going to do? Jacob, her father, what's he going to do? He doesn't have any power. He doesn't have any authority. What's he going to do? Raise arms and attack this entire city? So Joseph has had two brothers, Simeon and Levi. They got so mad that their sister got raped that they went, to make a whole long story short, they went, killed the guy, killed his family, and killed all the men in that town. I mean, it was a big deal. You don't rape women. You know what I mean? And here Joseph's being accused for it, and he just gets thrown in prison. Like that's amazing to me. That the fact that he only gets thrown in prison. It tells us a few things. It tells us that, number one, God was really watching over him. God still had a plan for him, number one. And number two, it probably makes you wonder how his relationship with his wife was. And it's interesting, the words she says when his wife talks to her husband. She says, "The Hebrew slave who you brought to us." It's almost like, man, you're really sticking it to him. Like maybe that's some marital problems, And I mean, maybe the fact that he didn't have Joseph executed was a good, maybe it's a good indicator that maybe he knew Joseph's character and he knew his wife's character. I mean, when you're married to someone, when you're sleeping with the person, you kind of you get to know them a little more. You get to know their character, and I'm sure he knew his wife's character, and I is definitely sure that he knew Joseph's character. So those are some interesting observations that we can make. But just because you live righteously like Joseph doesn't mean everything is going to go smoothly for you. You can still have a hard time. There was a friend at my past church. She was a counselor at a high school, and students would come to her and ask for advice about careers, and I got this going on, and she would talk with them, whatever. But sometimes the students wanted to know about her faith, and she was a God-fearing woman. She was a Christian, so she would tell them about Jesus because they asked. Well, her boss found out about it, and when her boss found out about it, her boss said, "If I find out you tell any more students about Jesus, I'm going to fire you." Oh, okay. That's not good. Another student came to her and started asking her questions, asking for advice, and then starts asking her about her faith again. So she shares her faith again. Boss finds out, fires her. She spent the next year unemployed, looking for a job. Nothing happens, all because she tells someone about Jesus. She survived by people in her church giving unanimous checks to her. That's how she paid her rent. Sometimes living a godly life doesn't mean we're going to have a good life, but it certainly does mean that we're on God's good side, that's for sure. The second thing, as we continue reading in Psalm 105, we come to verse 19. And it says, "Until the time came to fulfill his dreams, the Lord tested Joseph's character." This is probably like one of the best parts that I like about this passage. The word dreams, what it's referring to is it's referring to the dreams that God gave Joseph. Remember, he gave him 2 dreams that he was going to be this mighty leader. Other translations say, until God fulfilled the word. So they switched the word dream and replaced it with the word word. And another interesting thing is the word tested is better translated refined. So I guess you can you can read this. The Lord refined Joseph's character until the time came to fulfill his word. So you see that there's almost a waiting period that Joseph needs to go through before he's ready to do what God wants him to do. You see, everything happens in God's timing, not our timing. And God promised Joseph something really big, that he was going to use God in a really big way, but it wasn't ready yet. And that's really important because sometimes God speaks to us through dreams, or he gives us these big dreams or these big promises or all these great things that God wants to do with us. He tells us, but it doesn't mean we're supposed to do it yet. Usually the next step is waiting and pain. Because when we wait and when we go through pain, it really molds us. That's where God can pin us to the corner and do with us what he wants us to do. But sometimes we want to jump the gun and do what God wants, what we want to do, or what we think God wants us to do. I was going somewhere with that. So many times, like I was saying from the previous point, we think that if we do good things, we're on God's good side. And if things are going right in our lives, we're on God's good side. But Jesus was pretty opposed to this too. Jesus, he's the perfect example of how this is so not true. If you look at Jesus, he was the Son of God. He was the creator of the universe. And he was born in a barn with animals. And he was poor. We know he's poor because when his parents took him to the temple to offer sacrifices, the law says that you're going to offer a lamb. But then it says if you're poor, you can offer a pigeon. And we know from the Gospels that they offered a pigeon, not a lamb. So we know he was poor. He was just a carpenter, but he was like the Son of God, and he's a carpenter. He wasn't a lawyer. He wasn't this man who had all this money. He was just an everyday man. And that actually makes me feel better because I'm a mechanic. So if God can use Jesus, he can use me.